Thank you very much for giving me your time for joining the session. I have prepared some very brief comments, and of course, I hope to learn from you also in the discussion that will follow the brief prepared comments. The presentation has many slides. I will skip through some slides, but I'll just focus on a few key messages. I think it's fair to say that in the last couple of decades, a number of countries have made very impressive transitions, all on the back of information communications technology. Certainly this country is one that is often talked about as having used ICT very strategically and very wisely. There are other countries that we can refer to, both in Europe and around the world. In Europe, we think of countries like Finland. Finland, about 2 decades ago, had a major crisis when Soviet Union fell. They had to transform the entire economy from a natural resource-based economy to one which today is much more knowledge-based. If you look in other economies around the world, people talk about Singapore as being an excellent example. Singapore, once again, has transformed itself quite impressively over the last couple of decades. In the Middle East, you have examples like Israel and Qatar. Israel today is seen as a very highly innovative nation. And Qatar, which was probably 7, 8 years ago not really on the ICT map, today is doing fairly impressive things in the world of ICT. So I can take a number of examples, and clearly the two big giants globally, the emerging giants, if I can use the term, are India and China. And India and China today already have enormous number of R&D centers, very successful ICT companies, and this strength and this transformation of these economies will continue going forward. Now, at the same time, about 10, 12 years ago, there were a number of questions raised about how do we measure, how do we analyze the impact of technology on development, on competitiveness. And I refer back to the times when we had the internet boom era in the late 90s and a lot of enthusiasm about ICT. There were a number of stories in particular talking about how farmers in Africa or how villagers in some other country in India or some other province in India, whatever, they were using technology for amazing things. But there wasn't really a very clear framework for trying to understand how can we look at the policy aspects of technology and development, technology and competitiveness, and even more, how can we move towards more evidence-based decision-making in this area, away from anecdotes to more evidence-based. So the work that I have been involved with is the Global Information Technology Reports, and this is something that I helped to create about 10 years ago, and today it has become a reasonably important influence in the debate around technology and competitiveness. It certainly adds a valuable perspective in the discussion that is ongoing in many economies and many governments around the world. And I would like to just also give you a sense of what kind of questions we face today. Next year, we will have the 10th anniversary of the Global IT Reports, and we are at the moment thinking about how will we create the next set of measures reflecting the changes that are taking place in the ICT industry. So that's a set of the key messages. As I said, there are many slides I will not necessarily go through in detail out here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what are the key issues that are happening out here. Now, in terms of the report itself, some of you might have seen the report. If you go to the website of the World Economic Forum, you'll see the report. And every year in the spring, we publish a report. And today, this report has become probably one of the most important reports on competitiveness published with the World Economic Forum. And as part of the report, we of course publish a score of the countries and the ranking of the countries. This is what gets the media attention, but that's not necessarily the most interesting part. Ireland, by the way, in the latest ranking is ranked at position 24. So it's a pretty good ranking. And at the same time, besides the ranking and besides analysis, what we also include are various thought leadership pieces from various experts on key elements. And we also include case studies on a variety of economies that have done interesting things over the last years. To give you a sense of the model, because the reason I'm spending a couple of minutes on this is important to understand our thinking, and it's also important to understand where we might be headed. So back in the late 90s, when we agreed that it would be nice to have some kind of a model to understand technology and measurement around this domain, there was no easy reference in that area because no one had done some work in that area. So we looked at other areas in management and asked the question, where else have people measured things for excellence, and what are some interesting histories of experiences we can refer back to? And the area which seemed the most relevant after our research was the domain of total quality management. I don't know how many of you know when the first quality award was awarded worldwide. Any guesses? 1951. Okay, Deming Award in Japan in 1951. If you look at 1951, the Deming Award was very much focused on statistical process quality control of the manufacturing line. Today, if you look at the European Quality Award model, which is listed out here, you see that the whole definition of quality has shifted from one that was very much focused on manufacturing and statistical process quality control to one that is much more holistic and looking at not just only one small element, but the entire organization. And if you look at the European Quality Award model and other, whether Malcolm Baldrige, other quality models have similar structures, they include some things called enablers, things that enable a company to have quality performance, and things that are the results outputs of having a quality organization. So we took this as an inspiration, really, and we came up with this kind of very simple model. And this model tried to identify who are the three actors, who are the main important actors in the ICT space. So we identified individuals, businesses, and governments. And we said that these three actors interact with each other. And of course, these three actors operate in an economy in the context of a certain climate that exists in the economy. So this model served as the basis for what we term today as the Networked Readiness Index. So this index measures the ability of an economy or a nation to leverage the potential of the network economy, of what's emerging from ICT. So if you look at the environment, you have aspects of the market, the political, the regulatory aspects, the infrastructure aspects, and then you have the two pillars of how ready are you to use technology and what's the actual impact. You will see that we use the term usage because we had to scale down ambitions. We started with impact and soon realized that we didn't have enough data to measure impact. So we went to a little bit more intermediate measure of usage. Now, this model serves as the basis for the overall framework and the measurement scheme that we use today. And I must emphasize 2 points. The first point is it is quite simple. And in retrospect, with hindsight, we realized that the simplicity has been one of the strengths. So when you put this slide up in front of any group, you don't have to spend more than a few minutes to explain it. It sort of makes sense. The second thing is today a lot of aspects out here might seem obvious and might seem fairly well accepted. Issues like including political regulatory aspects in the IT map, or issues like including the government very explicitly as a player out there. But I can assure you that 10 years ago or 12 years ago, it wasn't that clear for many. So also what we realized is this model is pretty complete. At least it served a pretty complete reference the last several years. And today, with the benefit of 10 years of data, what we find is some elements like the environmental aspects have proven to be very crucial in explaining the difference between economies that make good use or don't make as good use of technology. So that's the model, and I will sort of skip through a number of slides, if you allow me out here, that talk about other people have done. Now, I will just describe to you how some economies are using it. So 2 or 3 slides from Qatar. Now, I've been working with the government of Qatar for the last 7 years, and if you look at what Qatar and many economies in the region are trying to do, they're trying to use technology as a vehicle to leapfrog. They all realize that the economies have to get transformed from an energy basis to something different, knowledge-based economies. And today, in the Middle East in particular, there is a new generation of leaders that have come in these countries. So you look across the region, there's a new generation of leadership, and a lot of the new leaders, they have ambitions for society. They are much more modern in thinking. They want to modernize society, and they want to use technology as a tool for doing so. So what you see happening in Qatar is the process started with some kind of a national vision that was articulated by the heir apparent then. And that was further elaborated into some specific programs. And then the question was asked, what kind of a technology support do we need to provide to make this program successful? Now, the framework that was used was the same framework of the index that I described earlier of environment, readiness, and usage. And essentially that framework was used by Booz as a consulting organization to articulate the entire set of change programs in this country. So in the case of Qatar, what they did in the first few years was this framework just provided a mental map, some kind of an anchor to the thinking about technology in the country. Now, if you think about how countries typically thought about technology in this region, or at least traditionally have thought about it, often thought about it in very basic terms like what is the cost of telephone access, mobile access, how many telco operators do we have, how do we actually increase the competition in the telco sector. It was very much focused around telcos and access. And by having a framework like this to guide your thinking, you're able to have a much more broader perspective, which is very helpful to sell the program, to sell the initiatives to the, it's not just the ICT ministry, it's the entire government, entire country that has to buy into this. And you need the support of various economies, of various ministries in the economy to drive, for example, e-health or e-education and so on and so forth. So it just gives a visual and a nice mental map for putting together programs in the space. Of course, what you can also do is you can set up precise measures and frameworks. So what we always recommend is, every economy has to create some dedicated frameworks and measures that apply to its own context, its own vision, and situations are very different across economies. So again, a very quick snapshot of how one country uses it. Today, this framework has become the basis for technology deployment and thinking in at least a dozen economies around the world that I personally know of, and many others use it very deeply, at least in many different parts of their own thinking today. Now, looking at the future, and then I'll stop. Today we are thinking about the framework we came up with 10 years ago was very useful for guiding thinking over the last 10 years. And certainly it has helped drive some of the changes on the regulatory side and some of the educational side and so on. The question that we're facing is what happens now in the future? Now, the two important aspects that we have to deal with in the future. One is there's a basic questioning happening as we speak by a variety of organizations about how do we measure progress. So what is progress? Is it GDP or is it well-being? Is it some other definitions of multiple factors? So there is a basic questioning that is happening of what is progress. And of course, people are saying, well, it's not easy because it's not easy to just identify one additional measure or a couple of measures that solve the problem in this case. You have to have some kind of a mind shift change in how you look at economy, from not just production-oriented to much more well-being. Again, the well-being is a little bit more fuzzy, ambiguous term. you have to look at other dimensions, like, for example, equity, like, for example, sustainability. The local context becomes critical. In the case of many GCC countries, they're extremely concerned about identity, the culture. So it's something which may not be equally important for an economy in Europe, but some of those economies are very concerned about keeping and strengthening the local identity in the face of globalization, in the face of increasing, let's say, immigration in the country. And of course, people realize that single indicators may not be important, and the issues around comparability. So what we are doing right now, and this is a process we are engaged in as we speak, is we are trying to say, well, let's see what kind of a framework for defining ICT and competitiveness will work for the next 10 years. So what we had seems to have worked reasonably well in the last 10 years. Now, what's the solution, or what's the appropriate guidance that we can give them through some kind of mental map for the next 10 years? And here we are faced with the questions of what is progress, as I said earlier, but also what is ICT? Today, the boundaries of ICT are shifting, as we speak. It's no longer hardware, telecom services. It's also issues like media, creativity, other aspects. As ICT becomes more ubiquitous, the whole question about what is ICT itself has to be questioned. And today, there are very important issues that we have to think about. Is if we think about government leadership or government policies in this area, how do we put in place the right kind of a structure, framework, and how can models like whatever we come up with in this process help guide the thinking of decision makers in governments around the world? So this is our challenge. If you have ideas about what we can do about this, and I'm very happy to listen to you and engage in discussion with you, but this is really a very short summary of where I come from in terms of the measurements and the discussions we've had over the last 10 years, how some governments have used it, and how we see some of the issues in this space going forward. So let me conclude my prepared remarks at this point, and with your permission, open it up for a more informal discussion on some issues linked to this. At the same time, I can also take questions, and I can give you my viewpoints, right or wrong, on other issues around innovation, around what other governments do, and so on. I would be rather careful about giving advice to you as a country, because many of you, most of you, know much more about your own country than I do. But nevertheless, happy to engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.